$1.3 trillion in equity just disappeared, according to Black Knight. The largest dollar amount drop in equity ever in history was just recorded. Does this mean that we have to worry about people being upside down on their mortgage? Do they not have enough equity? And then we're also going to discuss one of the biggest problems right now, and that's the fact that equity that's still there is frozen. And we'll explain what that means. Hey there, Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates. This channel is about helping real people understand real estate. And we're here to talk about this monstrous loss in equity in the United States that just occurred in the third quarter of 2022. But maybe a first important question to answer is, what exactly is equity? So the quickest way to answer this question is take the value of the home, subtract any financing against it, and what's left over is the equity. So if you have a home worth $500,000, you have a $300,000 loan, there is $200,000 in equity. And what happens if the loan is bigger than the value of the home? Well, that home is underwater, or also known as having negative equity. So if you're ready to dive into the Black Knight Mortgage Monitor report, hit that like button and let's get started. So let's dive into the data. Let's look at homeowner equity and see what happened. Where did $1.3 trillion go? Well, we're going to show you here in the numbers. So again, this is from Black Knight. They just released their latest report here in November, but this goes back to September. So it's like the Case-Shiller index. It lags a few months while they collect the data and normalize it and make sure it's accurate. So you can see we're going all the way back to 2004. What has happened to equity? We see the peak and then we see a valley, and that valley was after the global financial crisis. During the previous recession and beyond, it took a while for equity to build back up. We can see 2012 is when things changed and started to go back up. Then we get over here to COVID. So it was kind of slow at first, and you can see into Q1, Q2, Q3. Then all of a sudden it took off as we got into late 2020, early 2021. And then it hit a peak, and that peak was actually the second quarter of 2022. And we all know what happened. Interest rates went through the roof. And since then, sales have slowed significantly. And that's how we end up here in quarter three, where we go, for the first time in a long time, we see a drop, and a big drop. In fact, the largest dollar value drop in history is what just occurred. $1.3 trillion in one quarter disappeared. This puts us off the peak, which was in May. Puts us off the peak of, we've lost about 1.5 trillion total in equity in the nation. So looking at these numbers, you can see the light gray is the total equity, and then the blue is tappable equity. And what tappable equity means is it's an 80% loan to value. So that's all. If you're going to tap into equity, you're going to refinance. That's all you can do is you can get up to 80% of it. You have to leave 20% equity in the house. So that is what we see here. That blue is the tappable, which that also dropped, which naturally, if the total equity drops, the tappable equity is going to drop as well. So with this drop, we are still, other than Q1 of 2022, we are still at a record high. You have to go back all the way a long time ago to Q4 of 2021 to see a number that was lower, which is not a very long time ago. Oh, and one more interesting fact about the drop in equity, about half of it alone was in the state of California. The state of California accounted for $770 billion in lost equity in the third quarter of 2022. Do we need to worry? Are homeowners going to start to go underwater as equity evaporates? But let's take a look and see how this loss in equity has led to a change in the number of people who are underwater on their mortgage. And of course, we have to see what happens in quarter four. That's why you're going to subscribe to my channel. My guess is the numbers are going to be a lot worse in quarter four. Quick, give me a prediction in the comments below on what you think is going to happen in Q4 2022 to equity levels in the United States. There's a lot going on in this chart, and what it's comparing is negative equity to limited equity mortgages. And limited equity mortgages would be mortgages with 10% or less in equity. They're not quite underwater. Underwater means that the homeowner owes more in financing, more in a mortgage than the home is worth. So you can see, if we compare September's going back, we can see during the global financial crisis, this is what happened. If you look at folks who had 10% or less equity in their home, that was 40% almost of homes at that point in time that had limited equity or were underwater. Those are crazy numbers, and that's why we saw the flood of inventory. That's why we saw the flood of foreclosures. It was people walking away. It was people giving up when there's that many people that were underwater. And this doesn't show the levels of how far they were underwater, just shows pure numbers. But they were significantly underwater in those times. Now we can see that when we look at this year, when we look at 2022, we're not seeing massive levels of properties underwater. In fact, as they share in the report, there's fewer than 500,000 properties that are underwater in the nation right now. And to put that into perspective, in September, there were a total of over 53.5 million active loans on homes in the United States. So this is a small percentage, less than 1% of homes are underwater in the United States. With these low numbers, we don't have to worry yet, although we need to continue to track this and see. Oh, and don't forget that just because a homeowner is underwater doesn't necessarily mean that they're in foreclosure. As long as they continue to have their job and the ability to pay their mortgage, most people will. So while we're seeing levels of equity drop, and this will continue, like I said, Q4, all bets are off. Can't wait to see how those numbers turn out. What is the biggest problem right now for homeowners with equity? That equity is frozen. And what do we mean by this? Well, it is very tough to tap into that equity. In the one report we showed, they talked about tappable equity. That's money that people can get at in the home if they do a refinance. Well, according to Black Knight, 90% of active first trust deeds, about 90% of the active loans out there, are at 5% or lower for the mortgage interest rate. Right now, we're at 7, and we continue to hover around that number, or maybe even go higher. So it doesn't make sense to use a loan to refinance, to tap into equity, unless somebody really needs to get at the equity, because they're going to be taking their loan at 5% or lower and turning it into a 7% or higher loan. Another way to tap in potentially would be a home equity line of credit, and those are tough to find in many cases, and if you do find it, it will be an adjustable rate mortgage, and those rates are very high as well. Additionally, another option would be to put a second mortgage on. That is another thing that in this market is hard to find and has high interest rates as well. The other way to tap into equity is to sell the property, and this does make sense for some people, but you still have to solve the puzzle of where you're going to live. And if you're going to buy something else, you're back in that same situation where you're paying a higher mortgage interest rate than you may have now. Not to mention that buyer demand is low right now, so it may take a longer time, may be tougher to sell. Of course, if you're thinking of doing any of this, make sure you reach out to us, because we can help give you some no pressure, no obligation advice on whether it makes sense for you to sell or not. We have a link below so you can reach out to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our free weekly email newsletter so you get updates like this, and you will know what happens in Q4 to the level of equity in the United States. And you're not going to want to miss this next video where we talk more about this crazy housing market. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates, and we want to hear from you.